Okay, and that said, let's now jump into a subject very much part of this regression, something I call the veneer of reason, by which ignorant mentalities, along with highly manipulative forces, promote bogus, poorly thought out social concepts in the realm of equality and equity, ultimately contributing to increased social harm, preserving the damaging status quo. I'm sure everybody remembers the U.S. doctrine of separate but equal long ago. So in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, the U.S. Supreme Court effectively codified racial segregation by suggesting that you could separate human beings based on race and still somehow it will all be equal. Segregated schools, buses, water fountains, etc. This is one of the many transitional stages after the abject slavery period. And to many, it likely sounded plausible at the time, even though it is a contradiction in terms which made itself well apparent. And while most today would never promote this old idea, understanding the history, the notion of separate but equal serves as a classic example of the use of reductive moral language and framing in service of ultimately inhumane ends. And the more modern examples I'm going to list now can be thought of in precisely the same way. They are oppressive slogan mechanisms, masquerading as morally tangible, infecting the minds of many in the conservative movement. So number one, the myth of meritocracy. Meritocracy means people come into positions or roles on the basis of their demonstrated abilities or merit, right? The old, if you work hard, you can succeed. Success is just about effort and talent, and the best rise to the top. And we all know this is a half-truth at best, but it sounds plausible to some, reinforcing the idea that modern socioeconomic dynamics are, in fact, a level playing field, a mythology that, among other things, conveniently ignores the deeply entrenched structures of institutional racism, sexism, class hierarchy pressures, and so forth. It dismisses the imbalanced structural landscape people are forced to navigate. And while cultural trajectories are problematic enough, I will reiterate that there is no such thing as a meritocracy inside a market-based society, as the system produces constant feedback loops that reinforce advantage to those already ahead, fostering a cascade of downstream inequalities. And part of the intellectual problem here is people simply aren't trained to think in this kind of way in a systems framework. They think anecdotally, right? So if a person grows up in poverty and manages to become a CEO, that anecdote gets elevated, and from there people say, see, anyone can make it. You just have to work hard. The exception used to define the rule. And if people buy into that, they don't blame the system for anything, for their own suffering. They don't see it. They blame themselves, transforming injustice into personal failure. Number two, next we have these anti-DEI, anti-affirmative action slogans and ideas. Part of the basic democratic process has been generating institutional awareness that the economic system is, in fact, inherently rigged against some groups. The objection, of course, is that this kind of thing is discriminatory in and of itself. From the very moment such interventionist ideas were created to try and overcome direct and systemic oppression of minorities, this narrative has been there. Let's hear from the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan in 1982 on the subject.
We believe in the white race. We believe that at this point in time that white Americans are being treated as second-class citizens, that the federal laws, the civil rights laws, have created a dual system of justice in this country. A set of federal laws that protects the interest of minorities and local and state laws.
But Grand and Imperial Wizard,
if I may, of white people.
If I may interrupt, if I might be so bold as to interrupt the Imperial Wizard.
And again, the defending stories are always anecdotal and speculative. Someone complains that their kid didn't get into college, and then they see a minority there and think that's why. Same for some job opportunity. It is simply the very idea that is opposed, not understanding its necessity, which can only be understood through a systems lens once again. And I can't believe I feel the need to say this, but let it be known that there has never been a study to show that the perceived victim in this narrative, ultimately the white male, has been overridden in his advantage. The white male in the United States and across much of the world is still dramatically advantaged on every level of analysis, on average, from pay scales to higher education, to job opportunities, to political opportunities, and so forth. It is cartoonish for any white male to sit there and talk about their own oppression as a general idea across society. Framing the tools designed to correct injustice, recasting them as injustice itself, erases the actual history of oppression that led to these tools being needed in the first place. It cloaks long overdue remediation in the language of unfairness. I will also add that such tools are actually very minimally effective anyway, but it is the best we have from the perspective of policymakers who are not going to go any farther in terms of true measures to create equity and equality. So these interventions against the system is all they're willing to do, pathetically enough, but they are still needed. Not to mention, on a deeper level, recognition of such reality, which this process attempts to correct, constantly reminds everyone about the true history of the United States and the world. And as I will talk about more so in a moment, that very reality is destabilizing to establishment power. They want everybody to forget. Number 3, the myth of market purity. I have run this into the ground many times, but this remains the most pernicious myth of all, the belief in unregulated free markets as somehow fair, natural, or self-correcting. It is perhaps the most foundational glue that holds the entire regressive worldview together. The empirical record, the structural logic, and even the mathematics of how markets work debunk all libertarian assumptions on the issue. And to promote faith in self-regulated markets means, by extension, to support damaging social inequalities. And the most notably punished in this system are, of course, minorities, snowballing the economically rooted oppression generation after generation. As of 2023 in the United States, the top 1% holds over 30% of all wealth. The median white household holds 8 times the wealth of the median black household, and 5 times that of the median Latino household. Black Americans make up 13% of the population, but hold only 3% of the nation's wealth, a result of generations of compounded exclusion, redlining, segregated education, suppressed wages, and so forth, driven again by an economic system that thrives on imbalance. Consider homeownership. White Americans are at 72.7%, Black Americans 44%. And that's a big one when it comes to this generational wealth development, as this current system, facilitates. Same pattern with gender. Women still earn 82 cents in the dollar compared to men. Women of color, far less. Women are more likely to work low-wage jobs. Women also happen to perform over 75% of all unpaid care work, labor the market doesn't even acknowledge, let alone value. Also, as mentioned in other podcasts, the work of physicists and mathematicians like Bruce Boghossian, building on decades of investigations using agent-based modeling, has demonstrated that even in a hypothetical society where everyone starts equal and plays literally fair, the market still tends toward oligarchy and consolidation of wealth and hence power. In other words, it's not just extrinsic forces such as capital accumulation and layers of strategy because someone has more wealth. It's actually intrinsic to the very act of mass trade itself, the imbalance creating forces. And unless you introduce external redistributive forces, regulation, taxation, policy correction, etc., wealth concentration will continue until, in effect, one person in society has all the wealth. That's what the math shows. It's a perpetually reinforcing feedback loop of exponentially increasing inequality built into market economics. So when people fight against regulation and intervention in the name of market purity, they are not defending freedom. They are defending a system that protects privilege and inequity. Moving on to number 4, revisionist history and cultural erasure. This is the age-old power drive to rewrite history and control narratives, for if a population is allowed to understand what has actually happened, specifically in this case, what the system has produced and who holds the cards over time, faith in institutions may be eroded or questioned. Take the classic example of Christopher Columbus, celebrated in public education as a hero, when in fact his role was one of genocide, slavery, and systemic terror. And to this day, there is a battle to preserve the former perspective, dismissing the latter. In 2023, over 1,600 books were banned from public libraries and schools in the U.S. Most of these texts dealt with race, LGBTQ equality, identity, gender theory, and historical injustices. A campaign of historical sanitizing, masquerading, of course, as moral concern. From current efforts to defund entire academic departments, to the criminalization of so-called critical race theory in public schools, it's all a systematic effort to protect the power structure and power culture by eliminating historical relationships. On February 14th, 2025, a Dear Colleague letter coming from Trump's likely-to-be-removed Department of Education read, "Educational institutions have toxically indoctrinated students with the false premise that the United States is built upon systemic and structural racism and advances discriminatory policies and practices. Proponents of these discriminatory practices have attempted to further justify them, particularly during the last 4 years, under the banner of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, smuggling racial stereotypes and explicit race consciousness into everyday training, programming, and discipline." And when you read these kinds of statements, you often notice that any issue raised on the issue of race or the like is then deemed as some kind of deliberate attempt at contrived division itself, as if to address racism in and of itself is overtly derisive, which is a pretty clever form of manipulative propaganda if you think about it. I do think, as an aside, given how damaged society is, there are people that go too far at times and see racial discrimination where there is none in a given instance, which can also be politicized, such as the endless false claims of anti-Semitism coming from the State of Israel as it continues its ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Palestinian people. But that kind of manipulation does not overshadow the truth of bigotry on this planet. In fact, let's go further in the context of revisionist absurdity. Pete Hegseth of the U.S. Department of Defense is on record for attending a church pastored by someone named Doug Wilson, a man who has publicly described American slavery as a virtual paradise for the slaves. He wrote, and I quote, "Slavery produced in the South a genuine affection between the races that we believe we can say has never existed in any nation before the war or since. There has never been a multiracial society which has existed with such mutual intimacy and harmony in the history of the world," he continues. Painting slavery as lovely, he says, "Slave life was to the slaves a life of plenty, of simple pleasures, of food, clothes, and medical care." Amazing. I assume everyone remembers 1984, where Winston Smith works at the Ministry of Truth, and his job was to falsify records, rewrite history, and erase inconvenient facts from public memory. But that was top-down, overt dictatorship. The reality we face today is far more diffused. It's not one ministry. It's a network of decentralized whitewashing interference. Books aren't just banned by the state. They're pulled by school boards, pressured by parent organizations that are funded by think tanks. University departments aren't just defunded arbitrarily. They are delegitimized in public discourse, undermined through political agitation, and attacked through legislative censorship. It's a socio-cultural political machine of whitewashing history. As Chomsky, of course, detailed in Manufacturing Consent, liberal democracies don't need overt suppression to maintain ideological dominance. They rely on control through framing, through omission, through media filters, through the institutional narrowing of acceptable discourse, and so on. The result is a society where the foundational oppression and rights violations of the past are whitewashed once again, where slavery becomes discovery, where patriarchy becomes tradition, and where systemic inequality becomes individual failure, etc. Let's continue. Number 5, free speech absolutism as a shield for hate. This is a sensitive one. I know there's a lot to be said about the need to preserve free speech in the general sense, especially on the political level. But today, the demand for free speech has become a kind of rhetorical shield, invoked not to defend principled dissent, but increasingly to justify cruelty, disinformation, political manipulation, and hate under the guise of neutrality. Elon Musk did not take over Twitter to open the conversation up in good faith. He took over Twitter to release the legion of factless, biased, ideological belligerents with views that he actually likes personally because their values support his position of wealth and power and ultimately discrimination. What has happened today, especially on social media platforms, is a cynical appropriation of democratic free expression, serving to preserve oppressive and unsustainable perspectives and motives. And sure, I get the general counter-argument where people say, but is it not subjective, Peter? Who is anyone to decide what is right and wrong? Well, that's exactly the kind of reductive moral relativism people that promote hateful, elitist, oppressive speech and hence actions put forward. The subject has to be thought about far more deeply. From a systems perspective, we can recognize empirically and formally that speech does not necessarily self-balance or self-regulate toward the truth, in the same fantasy put forward with the invisible hand of the market to create economic balance. I state this again, not in support of any kind of overt censorship, but as a matter of historical fact that must be dealt with and not denied. The system of free speech, as we are taught to think about it, is incomplete as a concept in most people's minds. In the same way, people, again, do not understand the endogenous nature of market economics and the imbalance inherent to the structure that overlaps. Only in this case, the environmental structure for speech is a confluence of factors that have to be viewed holistically to understand what the total system is doing when it comes to human communication in the world today. Just look at Twitter, or X, as Elon Musk took it over, for example. According to the Center for Countering Digital Hate, the use of slurs against black users increased by over 200%, anti-Semitic posts surged by more than 60%, homophobic rhetoric skyrocketed, hate speech became not just more visible, but more engaged with, due to the profit-driven dynamics of platform algorithms. A separate study by Montclair State University confirmed that hate speech surged, particularly targeting marginalized groups, of course, and former ex-employees have since revealed what many have suspected, that inflammatory content is privileged by design. Why? Because rage equals clicks, controversy equals revenue, social harm monetized at scale. Now, say what you will about the general idea of free speech long before the internet, but this so-called free speech on social media is in part an incredibly destructive force, as it is combining with profit-seeking algorithms and, of course, an infinite number of bots that fill in the gaps to create momentum. As an aside, if you want to do anything to stop the dangerous data pollution on the internet, these social media companies need to ban all of these bots. Today, these bots are using natural language models, becoming indecipherable from normal human communication, and the ramifications of that cannot be overemphasized in terms of destructive potential through aggressive astroturfing, misinformation, and all sorts of other strategies to guide public opinion. And most people are not that aware today and are vulnerable to all of this, being unable or unwilling to move against the perceived group consensus as well at times. You remember the Asch conformity experiments in the 1950s. Social media is both polarizing and conformity producing. Another study from 2005 called Neurobiological Correlates of Social Conformity linked biological processes to group conformity as well. You know, when you see something on social media and all the comments are biased in the same way, and such influence can change how people perceive, and it does. This is also why some scientific journals have removed comment sections, because they noticed how influenced people were by the comments alone as opposed to the evidence-based info in the actual article. In the end, in the current climate, it will be this obsession with free speech, absolutism, that will facilitate the rise of true fascism in the United States and beyond, due to how toxic the underlying systems of communication are. In Myanmar, for example, Facebook's unregulated platform played a critical role in fueling genocide against a minority there. Hate speech was viral and unchecked. And that's just one example. I mean, in the US, it gave rise, of course, to QAnon. And if you think about it, I really don't think the rise of Donald Trump would have happened if it wasn't for these very underlying structures and mechanisms and the bias they yield over public opinion. Remember the Cambridge Analytica scandal. At the current rate, social media may prove to be the most powerful brainwashing system the world has ever seen, even though we can all understand its positive decentralizing potentials as well. But, once again, you can blame the market economy for sabotaging yet another possibly positive advancement for society, turning it into a weapon. In a 2018 MIT study, it found that falsehoods on social media are 70% more likely to be retweeted than the truth, and they reach users 6 times faster. Not just because people can be stupid, but because our neuropsychology appears hardwired to react to sensationalism. I'm always hesitant to use terms like human nature, but we do have shared average reactions. And again, they are often weaponized. And of course, children, needless to say, are deeply vulnerable. People in formative stages of identity development, and then you just grow a society where normalized bigotry and factless thinking metastasize before the cognitive tools of discernment are even fully formed in the human being. So, to be clear here, I am not putting forward an argument for authoritarian control or preemptive censorship in the realm of free speech. That is a false binary used to shut down this legitimate critique. Which brings us now to number 6, which pairs in well with this, the both sides fallacy. This is very much tied to the myth of absolute free speech, the belief that every social view must be framed as a symmetrical debate between sides. And on the surface, this sounds democratic, but in practice, it functions as a Trojan horse for legitimizing nonsense, hate, and deeply regressive worldviews. While it is true in the realm of science that things are falsifiable, meaning there will always be change to our understanding, and sometimes dramatically so, it does not remove the fact that truth as a general utility does in fact exist. Not all ideas deserve equal weight at a given stage of intellectual evolution. Not every viewpoint is worthy of a platform. And when we pretend otherwise, we're not protecting free inquiry at all. Rather, we are abandoning basic standards that make meaningful dialogue possible, opening the door for regression. As philosopher Karl Popper famously articulated in his Paradox of Tolerance, if a society extends tolerance to those who are actively intolerant, the intolerant will eventually destroy that society's capacity to be tolerant at all. We have to decide as a civilization what kind of world we want to embrace. If we want a world based on highly probable truth, defined by scientific rigor and evidence, along with a world that is sustainable, meaning the ecosystem is balanced, with society not constantly fighting with itself, then the values become very clear. Views promoting environmental unsustainability are dangerous and destabilizing. Views promoting racism, bigotry, sexism, and intra-group contempt is destabilizing. People promoting superstition over scientific rigor is indeed destructive and destabilizing. Destabilizing to the very basic goals of our very survival. And of course, tolerance is important in general. But if you are platforming a Nazi today on the same stage as a human rights advocate, it doesn't even matter what they talk about. You are giving credence to the Nazi who holds intolerant and abjectly regressive perspectives, destabilizing perspectives, by making it seem like each opinion can be considered equal. A healthy, pluralistic society isn't just a place where everyone speaks. It's a place where ideas are weighed, tested, and judged. Some perspectives elevate societies, others drag them into regression. Just as we no longer give equal platform to, say, flat earth theorists in science classrooms, we must stop giving equal credibility to those who would deny the humanity or dignity of others in the public sphere, as we see constantly today in the human rights saga. Podcasts is just disgusting, the kind of dialogue that should have gone away a long time ago. Fairness does not mean treating every idea as equal. It means treating every person with equal dignity and rejecting the ideas that seek to take that dignity away. On to number 7, colorblindness as a virtue. Another seemingly well-meaning but deeply harmful idea, often framed as moral progress, is the notion that we should just not see race anymore. It echoes, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream of judging people not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And while noble in principle, this vision doesn't reflect our current reality, and pretending it does is damaging and helps facilitate ongoing marginalization and oppression. Sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva critiques this colorblind racism, which downplays racial hierarchy by simply ignoring it. And in most cases today, when we fail to see race, we fail to address the disparities tied to it. In a society where race influences life expectancy, wealth, incarceration rates, education levels, and healthcare and beyond, neutrality just doesn't work. It's denialism. There are, once again, massive structural disadvantages, not due to individual failings, but systemic ones. That said, nuance is always essential. Critiquing colorblindness doesn't mean that one reduces every interaction to identity politics, as if it's ubiquitous and inescapable at every inch of our lives. There is a distinction between recognizing systemic injustice and stereotyping. For instance, it's true that Black communities have endured housing discrimination, but it's wrong to assume every Black individual is a victim in every context. Overgeneralization leads to attribution error, assuming bias where there may be none, and that is also destabilizing. Sure, once again, there is a tendency for some people to look for reasons to be angry where in fact there is none directly, as mentioned before, which is also one of the side effects of maintaining any sort of group identity at all, as I've often talked about, because all group identity is indeed dangerous in and of itself, but we are stuck with these fabricated relationships because of the real-world reality of the history of group oppression, what we have created that continues. Ideally, one day we may not see color or all sorts of other categorical groups. But until race and other group identifiers no longer shape people's lives, choosing not to see it is not progress, it is just regression disguised as virtue. Number 8, the false victimhood narrative. Another narrative put forward to marginalize is that we live in a woke victimhood culture, casting those speaking out against injustice as fragile, weak, attention-seeking, or grievance-addicted. By pathologizing cause for justice as emotional manipulation or petty, the real issues can be mocked and ignored. It's a silencing tactic, and a highly effective one, and not new, long used to discredit social resistance. Martin Luther King Jr., again, who was kind of unpopular in his time. In the 1966 Gallup poll, 63% viewed him as unfavorable. And why? Because he exposed the lie that racial equality had already been achieved. And he was accused of stirring up trouble and being divisive to the nation once again. In fact, the pattern goes back further than that. Suffragists were dismissed as hysterical. LGBTQ plus activists during the AIDS crisis were painted as manipulators seeking special treatment. You're not brave or principled, you're just playing the victim. You are woke, which is now a slur applied to anyone challenging dominant norms. And the backlash isn't just cultural now, it's increasingly legislative, which is terrifying. As social psychology shows, perceived loss of privilege often feels like oppression. Studies have shown that many white Americans now believe anti-white bias is a bigger problem than anti-black bias, despite all evidence to the contrary once again. And ironically, of course, those decrying victimhood in this way often indulge in it themselves, claiming they're being canceled, silenced, or oppressed for telling the truth. Moving on. Next, we have the classic law and order claim. We hear this manipulative rhetoric all the time today, suggesting basic justice and stability, while in practice it serves as a coded call for racialized policing and violent maintenance of inequality on many levels. And to be clear, when I use the word justice, I'm talking about impartial fairness in general, both in direct treatment and in the very structure of society. A just society, right? Now, this law and order phrase likely gained momentum with Richard Nixon in around 1968, I believe, framed as a response to crime. It was a calculated appeal to white voters resentful of civil rights gains. His Southern strategy, as it was called, painted civil rights activism and black political expression as essentially threats. Years later, Nixon aide John Ehrlichman admitted, open quote, We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or blacks, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing those heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Closed quote. And it evolved from there. Under Ronald Reagan, the war on drugs intensified this tactic, despite similar drug use across races. Black Americans were disproportionately targeted. Policies like the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine revealed the racial agenda. Then Bill Clinton comes along with his 1994 crime bill, which expanded prisons and imposed harsh sentencing laws. And you had Hillary Clinton's super predator remark, further demonizing black youth. The phrase law and order had fully evolved into a bipartisan mechanism of systemic control. George Floyd's murder in 2020. What did we hear? The call for law and order again, returned with force. Trump labeling protesters as thugs. He deployed federal troops on civilians and declared himself the president of law and order. It reframes protests as chaos and suppression as peacekeeping. And finally, the last one for today, number 10, charity over justice. This is a little bit different, but just as effective. This is a seductive myth that upholds modern inequality. It glorifies charity as a substitute for balance. Private benevolence serving to obscure and sustain systemic exploitation and harm. During the Gilded Age, tycoons like Carnegie and Rockefeller built fortunes and then used portions of their wealth to fund public institutions, casting themselves as benevolent heroes, walking symbols of the supposedly egalitarian system of capitalism. In truth, preserving the unjust wealth and power structures. Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, as it was called, promoted giving, but only on the wealthy's terms. This paternalism persisted, where tax-deductible donations double as PR, while inequality simply deepens over time. Today's billionaire philanthropists, Gates, Bezos, Musk, Zuckerberg, they're praised for their giving, while their companies, of course, profit from tax avoidance, worker exploitation, and monopolistic control. According to the Institute for Policy Studies, the 25 richest Americans paid an effective tax rate of just 3.4%, lower than most workers. Meanwhile, their charitable foundations let them steer public priorities in private ways, dictatorially, all while claiming some kind of moral leadership. Bill Gates loved to say this kind of stuff. Hence, they are fundamentally anti-democratic, and the behavior recently of Elon Musk should prove all of that as well. In the end, charity is seen as proof that inequality is a tolerable thing, and we just have to rely on the rich to be generous. It shifts focus from systemic failure to elite benevolence, casting the poor not as citizens with rights, but as passive recipients of goodwill. Now, all of that said, these 10 items are just but a few of other intersecting ideas and narratives that pollute people's ability to see and think clearly, not recognizing the class war con game that surrounds them.